The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, blending with the clatter of shopping carts and the chatter of tired customers. The supermarket was alive with its usual chaos, children tugging on their mothers' sleeves, cashiers scanning items with mechanical beeps, and managers shouting orders from across the aisles. Yet within this everyday noise a story was about to unfold, one that would silence the room, shift every heart inside, and leave the world with a lesson no one would forget. At the far end of the store, an elderly woman shuffled forward, her shoulders slightly hunched beneath the weight of years. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her hands clutched a small coin purse as if it contained her very life. Every step she took was measured, every glance nervous. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind that told a silent story of sacrifice and survival. She paused at the bread aisle, running her frail fingers over the loaves as though calculating silently in her head. Her lips moved in a whisper, counting coins, perhaps, before she carefully placed the cheapest loaf into her basket. Next came milk, but not the large carton others grabbed without thinking. No, she lifted the smallest one, her eyes darting back to the purse in her hand before setting it gently beside the bread. To the casual observer, she was just another shopper. But for those who looked closer, it was clear. This woman was fighting a quiet, daily battle, one of dignity against poverty, of hope against humiliation. Most customers didn't notice her. Some looked with pity, others with impatience as she moved slowly in the aisles. But there was one man who did notice. At the corner of the store, near the refrigerated section, a tall figure stood with a hood pulled over his head. He seemed out of place, blending into the crowd yet commanding presence without effort. His basket was filled with simple groceries, eggs, rice, vegetables, nothing flashy. He didn't speak, didn't draw attention to himself, but his eyes followed everything. The man was calm, steady, as if the noise of the world couldn't touch him. There was strength in his posture, a quiet energy in the way he carried himself. To anyone else, he might have been just another shopper. But destiny had placed him there for a reason, for when arrogance would strike, when cruelty would try to break a fragile soul, he would be the one to rise. The old woman clutched her coin purse tighter, stepping toward the front registers. Her basket wobbled as she lifted it, but she pressed forward with quiet determination. She wasn't here for luxury. She wasn't here to impress. She was here to buy the bare necessities that would keep her going. And yet, fate had cruel eyes, watching, eyes ready to humiliate. As she approached the checkout lane, whispers began. A few customers noticed her trembling hands, the coins she had begun to sort in advance. Some smirked, already anticipating the delay. Others sighed, shifting their weight, eager to be rid of the burden of waiting behind her. But it wasn't the whispers that would break her heart. It was the voice that soon cut through the noise, sharp and merciless, dripping with arrogance. A young cashier, lips curled into a mocking smile, leaned forward as the old woman placed her few items on the belt. "Oh, wonderful," the cashier muttered loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Another one of those shoppers, let me guess. You're paying with pennies?" The words landed like stones. A couple of teenagers laughed nearby. A man behind her rolled his eyes. And the elderly woman, she lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushing red as her lips trembled. She whispered softly, I have enough." But the cashier wasn't finished. "People like you hold up the line. Maybe next time try shopping at a place you can actually afford." The old woman's hand shook as she fumbled with her purse. The sound of clinking coins echoed louder than any beep of the register, louder than the chatter of the crowd. Each coin that dropped onto the counter seemed to weigh the air with shame. And then, in that moment of humiliation, something shifted. The hooded man set down his basket. Slowly, deliberately, he began walking forward. Each step carried weight, each movement deliberate, as though time itself recognized what was about to happen. Shoppers turned, whispers rising, eyes widening as they recognized the towering frame, the familiar presence hidden beneath the hood. "Wait," one whispered. Could it be?" The cashier glanced up, annoyance flashing in her eyes before faltering at the sight. But she didn't yet understand who stood before her. The elderly woman trembled, coins slipping from her hand as she bent to pick them up. Her knees shook, her dignity crumbling before the eyes of strangers. And still, the man in the hoodie walked forward, silent, unshaken, his presence alone cutting through the cruelty in the air. For soon the world would know. When arrogance tries to crush the fragile, when cruelty mocks the humble, there comes a moment when kindness stands taller than power. And in that supermarket, on that ordinary day, when a poor woman was humiliated for daring to pay with coins, Dwayne, The Rock Johnson was about to change everything. The automatic doors of the supermarket slid open with a soft whoosh, letting in a rush of cool air from outside. A wave of shoppers pushed through, mothers with children tugging impatiently at their sleeves, men in business suits speaking into phones, teenagers laughing as they carried baskets of snacks. And then, quietly, almost unnoticed, came Mrs. Thompson. She was small, fragile even, her thin frame wrapped in a faded cardigan that had clearly seen better years. Her shoes were scuffed, the soles worn thin from countless miles, walked on careful, budgets. She leaned slightly on her old shopping cart, its wheels squeaking in protest with every push. To some, she looked like just another elderly woman running errands. But to anyone who truly really looked, they would see more. They would see the way her hand trembled ever so slightly as she guided the cart forward, the way her eyes darted quickly to the coin purse she clutched, as though its weight carried the sum of her entire world. Mrs. Thompson lived on a fixed income, every dollar stretched thinner than paper. Each trip to the grocery store was not a matter of convenience but a battle of numbers, prices, coins, and what she could sacrifice this week. Her first stop was the produce section. She paused by the apples, her eyes lingering on the bright, polished fruit stacked high under the glow of artificial lights. Families reached around her, tossing handfuls into bags without thought. Mrs. Thompson, however, hesitated. She picked up one apple, examined it carefully, and placed it back down. Too heavy. She picked another, smaller one, and weighed it again, in her hand before finally adding just 2 apples to a small bag. She glanced at her coin purse once more, lips moving silently as she recalculated. As she made her way further down the aisles, the difference between her and the other shoppers became painfully clear. Where others grabbed without hesitation, she counted. Where others loaded their carts with abundance, she chose with restraint. A loaf of bread only the cheapest. A small carton of milk, the kind many overlooked for its size. A bag of rice that would last her a week if portioned carefully. Every choice was deliberate. Every item was weighed not just by its cost in dollars, but in what it meant for her survival. Some shoppers noticed her. A young couple glanced at her with faint pity before turning back to their overflowing cart. A man in a crisp shirt frowned impatiently when her squeaky cart blocked his way, muttering under his breath as she apologized softly and moved aside. Most, however, ignored her completely. To them, she was invisible. But Mrs. Thompson did not let their indifference dull her spirit. She smiled at the children who darted past her cart, waved gently at a little girl staring curiously, and nodded with a quiet warmth to anyone who met her eyes. Her kindness was effortless, born not of wealth or luxury, but of a heart that still carried light despite the weight of hardship. At one point she stopped in front of the canned goods. Her hand reached out toward a can of soup, but she froze, pulling it back quickly. Instead, she opened her purse and began counting right there, in the aisle. 1 coin, 2, 3. Her lips whispered numbers, her brow furrowed. She sighed softly, her shoulders slumping before she reached for a smaller can, cheaper but less filling. She placed it in her cart with care, almost apologetically. Still, she smiled to herself. That was Mrs. Thompson. Even when the world gave her little, she chose to see enough. Even when her choices were small, she carried herself with dignity. Around her, shoppers continued in a blur, voices rising, carts clattering, children crying. And yet in the middle of it all, she was a figure of quiet resilience. A woman who had lived through decades of struggle but still carried warmth in her smile, still offered kindness in every glance. And somewhere in the background, near the Far end of the store, the man in the hoodie noticed her too. He didn't approach, not yet. He watched quietly, his gaze steady, as if drawn to her presence. The way she carried herself with quiet grace despite her hardship. The way she smiled at strangers even as she carefully counted her coins. He leaned against his cart, arms folded, hood still shadowing his face. Shoppers moved past him without recognition, without realizing who he was. But he didn't mind. For now, he simply observed. Because in this store, in this ordinary moment, the seeds of something extraordinary were being planted. Mrs. Thompson adjusted her cart and pushed forward, humming faintly to herself as though the tune could lighten the load. She had no idea of the storm waiting at the checkout lanes. No idea that her simple act of paying with coins would bring her humiliation before strangers, and no idea that in the very same store stood a man who would not let her dignity be torn apart. She paused once more, pulling her coin purse close, whispering, "I think it will be enough this time." And with that fragile hope, she made her way toward the front. What she didn't know was that her life and the lives of everyone in that store were about to change forever. The line at the checkout stretched long, an impatient snake of carts and baskets. Children whined for candy, parents hushed them, and tired workers tapped their feet as they checked their phones. In the middle of this ordinary chaos, Mrs. Thompson reached the front. She exhaled a shaky breath, placing her small collection of groceries on the conveyor belt. 2 apples, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a single can of soup. It wasn't much. To some it looked like scraps, but to her it was survival. Behind the register stood Vanessa. She couldn't have been more than 24. Her nails were painted a glossy red, her hair tied up in a high ponytail, and her name tag hung lazily on her bright uniform. Everything about her screamed impatience. She had that sharp look in her eye, the kind that measured people not by who they were, but by how much they could spend. As Mrs. Thompson carefully placed each item down, Vanessa sighed, loudly, the kind of sigh meant to be heard. She tapped her manicured nails against the counter, rolling her eyes so obviously that even the people in line behind Mrs. Thompson noticed. "Great," Vanessa muttered, not even trying to hide her disdain. "Another one of these." Mrs. Thompson froze for a moment, her thin hands trembling slightly as she pushed the bread closer. She tried to smile kindly, tried to ignore the sting of the words. "Good morning, dear," she said softly, her voice warm but fragile. "It's a little chilly outside today, isn't it?" Vanessa didn't look up. She scanned the bread. Beep, 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 the sound mechanical, impatient. Then she smirked. "Yeah, real cold. You know what else is cold? This line when it has to stop for 10 minutes while someone digs through pennies." A couple of teenagers behind Mrs. Thompson snickered. A man in a suit chuckled under his breath. Others shifted uncomfortably, not laughing but not speaking up either. Mrs. Thompson's cheeks flushed pink. She reached into her small coin purse, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a handful of coins, the metallic clinking as they hit. The counter echoed through the checkout lane louder than it should have been, magnified by the silence of judgment. She whispered, almost apologizing to the air, I should have enough." Vanessa leaned on the counter, folding her arms. "Take your time," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "We've got all day. Don't worry about the fact that there are people here who actually have places to be." Mrs. Thompson's hands shook harder. A quarter slipped from her grasp, rolling across the counter before dropping onto the floor. She gasped softly, bending slowly, painfully, to retrieve it. That's when Vanessa laughed. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the fragile dignity of the moment. "Unbelievable. If you can't afford to shop like everyone else, maybe you shouldn't be here." A ripple ran through the line. Some customers exchanged glances, awkward, unsure. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something under her breath. 1 or 2 people chuckled nervously, unwilling to confront the cruelty, but also unwilling to look away. Mrs. Thompson's lips quivered. She lifted her head, eyes wet, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hold anyone up." Her voice was so small, so filled with shame, it barely carried. Yet everyone heard it. She tried to smile again, the kind of smile meant to protect her from breaking down. But it faltered, trembling as much as her hands. Vanessa rolled her eyes once more, snapping gum between her teeth. "Look, ma'am, it's not my job to count your change all day. If you don't have enough, just say so. People like you—" She let the words hang, then finished with venom. "People like you don't belong in stores like this, either." Cruelty landed heavy. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and still Mrs. Thompson whispered, I do have enough." Her hands shook violently now as she sorted the coins one by one. Her body hunched, as though she could make herself small enough to disappear. The customers behind her muttered. Some rolled their eyes. Some stared down at their phones to avoid being part of the scene. Only a few looked on with sympathy, their discomfort written across their faces. But none of them spoke. None of them stopped it. Mrs. Thompson finally pushed the little pile of coins across the counter, her hand trembling so hard that a few slid onto the floor. She bent again, but this time slower, her knees stiff, her face tight with humiliation. The sound of laughter, quiet but cruel, came from someone in the line, and in that moment, the air shifted. At the far corner of the store, a shadow moved. The hooded man who had been quietly observing set down his basket. His movements were calm, deliberate, but they carried weight. Most didn't notice him yet. Their attention was on the trembling old woman, the coins scattered across the linoleum and the arrogant smirk plastered on Vanessa's face. But soon they would. And soon, the laughter, the whispers, the arrogance, they would all fall silent. Because this wasn't just a supermarket anymore. It was a stage where cruelty had tried to strip dignity from the weak, and where kindness, power, and truth were about to step forward. And when that hood came down, when his presence could no longer be ignored, the world inside that store would never forget what they saw. The line had grown longer, stretching down the aisle. Customers shifted on their feet, some craning their necks to see what the holdup was. Mrs. Thompson's trembling hands tried desperately to gather the coins she had dropped. The clinking sound as they hit the floor echoed like thunder in her ears. A boy in line whispered something to his mother, who quickly hushed him, glancing at the frail woman with pity. But behind them, a pair of teenagers snickered openly. One of them muttered, "Grandma's still living in the 1950s. And the other stifled a laugh. Mrs. Thompson bent lower, her old knees protesting as she reached for the scattered coins. The world seemed to move in slow motion. She could feel every eye on her back, hear every hushed whisper and muffled chuckle. Vanessa, the cashier, leaned casually on the counter with her arms crossed, watching without the slightest hint of sympathy. She popped her gum and shook her head. "You know," she said loudly enough for the line to hear, "if you can't afford real money, maybe you shouldn't be shopping here. This isn't a charity." The words cut sharper than any blade. Mrs. Thompson froze, her thin hand hovering above a nickel on the floor. She looked up at Vanessa, her lips trembling, but no words came. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the line. Some customers laughed under their breath, others shifted uncomfortably, caught between shame and silence. A mother holding her daughter's hand shook her head slowly, whispering to the child, "Don't ever treat people like that." But still no one spoke out. Mrs. Thompson finally gathered the last coin and stood with effort, her frail body shaking. She placed the coins on the counter with a soft clatter, as though they carried the weight of her dignity. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I just wanted to buy some bread and milk." The entire store seemed to fall into silence. Even the hum of the refrigerators in the dairy aisle felt muted. The words hung in the air like a plea, a reminder that behind the trembling hands and weathered face was a human being, simply trying to survive. But Vanessa wasn't moved. She smirked, counted the coins slowly and deliberately, sighing loudly with each one. "Pennies, nickels, honestly, this is pathetic," she said under her breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. Holding up the line for a couple of apples and a loaf of bread? Unbelievable. Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. She blinked rapidly, trying to stop them from falling, but one slipped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, ashamed to show her pain. The shoppers stared, their expressions ranging from pity to discomfort. Some looked away, pretending not to see. Others shifted uneasily, as if realizing that their silence made them complicit in the cruelty unfolding before them. The humiliation was complete. For Mrs. Thompson, time seemed to stop. Her world shrank to the counter before her, the sneering voice of the cashier, the scattered coins that felt like pieces of her dignity scattered on the floor. And in that silence, something stirred at the far corner of the store. The hooded man, who had been quietly watching, set his basket down. His massive frame straightened, his steps deliberate as he began to walk toward the register. At first, no one noticed. All eyes were locked on the trembling old woman and the smirking cashier. But soon, whispers began. Heads turned. The tension shifted because humiliation had pushed too far. And now, just as quiet, steady, and powerful was on its way. The store was frozen in an almost suffocating silence. All that could be heard was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above and Mrs. Thompson's shaky breaths as she tried not to cry in front of strangers. Vanessa smirked triumphantly, proud of the way she had put the old woman in her place. But in the back of the line, a shift was happening. The hooded man who had been silent until now straightened his back. His presence alone seemed to ripple through the air like a wave no one could see but everyone could feel. He set his basket down, carefully, deliberately, and stepped out of line. He didn't need to speak. His sheer size, the calm power in the way he moved, drew eyes instantly. The whispers began at once, hushed voices carrying like sparks through dry grass. Wait, is that? No way. It can't be. Look at him. The size, the way he walks. Could it be? The man's hood cast a shadow across his face, but his jawline, his build, the unmistakable weight of his presence left little room for doubt. One by one, shoppers realized who he was. Their eyes widened, their phones subtly raised. Vanessa, oblivious, rolled her eyes as the man approached. She snapped her gum and placed a hand on her hip. "Sir, you'll have to wait like everyone else," she said sharply, her voice carrying the same arrogance she'd used on Mrs. Thompson. The man didn't respond. He didn't need to. He stepped forward again, slowly, purposefully, his massive frame towering over the checkout lane. Each step seemed to echo even though the floor made no sound. Mrs. Thompson, still clutching her coin purse, turned and looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear at first, then softening as if she felt something she couldn't explain. It wasn't just his size that commanded attention. It was his stillness, his calm. He didn't fidget, didn't rush. He simply stood there, shoulders broad, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The line of customers parted instinctively, giving him space without realizing it. Mothers pulled their children closer, not out of fear, but out of awe. Men, who moments earlier had smirked at Mrs. Thompson, now avoided his gaze, ashamed. Vanessa, undeterred, raised her voice. "Sir, I said you'll have to wait. This lady doesn't have enough to pay, and you cutting in isn't going to fix that. Go back to your place in line." Her words dripped with condescension, but they fell flat against him, like pebbles thrown at a mountain. He didn't flinch, didn't even look at her. Instead, he lowered his hood slowly, pulling it back to reveal his face. The gasp that followed spread through the store like wildfire. Shoppers clapped hands to their mouths. Phones were raised higher now, whispers turning into stunned murmurs. "It's him? No way, that's The Rock. That's Dwayne Johnson." The atmosphere shifted instantly. It was no longer just a supermarket checkout line. It was a stage, and everyone had just realized they were in the presence of someone larger than life. Not just in size, but in spirit. Vanessa froze, her smug grin collapsing as color drained from her face. Her hands, once perched confidently on her hips, now hovered uncertainly in the air. She stammered, Wait, you're... The Rock finally moved, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with calm authority. He stepped forward, towering over the counter, and looked down at the trembling pile of coins scattered near Mrs. Thompson's groceries. His eyes softened as he glanced at her, then hardened as they shifted toward Vanessa. And still he hadn't said a single word. The silence was deafening. No one dared to laugh now. No one dared to speak. All eyes were on him. And in that silence, his presence spoke louder than any insult ever could. For a heartbeat, the store was utterly still. The man's hood fell back, and in an instant every whisper turned into gasps that echoed through the aisles. "It's him," someone whispered, clutching their phone. "No way. That's the Rock," another shopper exclaimed, nearly dropping their basket. A wave of shock rippled across the store. Shoppers fumbled for their phones, cameras flashing as they recorded the surreal moment. It wasn't just his size, his strength, or his presence. It was the recognition of who he was. Dwayne, the Rock Johnson, stood before them. Vanessa, the cashier who only moments ago had been brimming with arrogance, went pale. Her smirk vanished, her hands trembled on the register. Her jaw hung open in disbelief. Just seconds earlier she had mocked and humiliated an elderly woman, but now she stood face to face with a man whose reputation was built not only on fame, but on respect and humility. The Rock lowered himself to one knee, his massive frame somehow gentle as he crouched beside Mrs. Thompson. The old woman blinked in shock, tears still in her eyes. For a moment she seemed unsure if she was dreaming. With surprising tenderness, the Rock reached down and began picking up the last few coins she had dropped. He placed them carefully into her shaking hands. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said, his deep voice steady but kind, carrying across the silent store. "You don't have to be embarrassed. You've done nothing wrong. I'll cover this." His words washed over her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Mrs. Thompson's lip trembled as she whispered, I can't let you do that." The Rock smiled warmly. "It's not about what I let you do. It's about what I want to do. And today, I want to make sure you leave here with your dignity and your groceries." Then, standing to his full, towering height, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. Holding it up with calm authority, he turned to Vanessa. "Ring up everything," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of command but never raised. "Not just hers. Ring up everyone's groceries today. They're on me." For a moment, silence held like a suspended breath. And then, applause. It started with a single clap from the back of the line, then another and another, until the entire store erupted. Cheers and whistles filled the air, drowning out Vanessa's stunned silence. Customers raised their phones higher, capturing not just a celebrity in action, but a man showing the true meaning of kindness. Mrs. Thompson covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming freely now, not tears of shame, but of gratitude. Shoppers, who had moments earlier looked away in discomfort, now clapped with shining eyes, moved by what they were witnessing. Vanessa stuttered, I didn't mean." But her voice was drowned by the roar of applause. The Rock looked around the store, his eyes sweeping over every customer, every bystander, every witness to the moment. His presence alone seemed to fill the room with warmth, with strength, with something no amount of money could buy: respect. For the first time that night, the supermarket felt less like a store and more like a place where humanity had been restored. The applause slowly quieted, replaced by an expectant hush. Every eye in the store was fixed on him, not just because he was the Rock, but because of the way he carried himself, calm, steady, like a man about to say something that mattered. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably behind the register, her arrogance shattered, her face pale. She tried to busy herself with the scanner, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Mrs. Thompson clutched her groceries close to her chest, looking at the Rock with gratitude and disbelief. The Rock turned, his gaze sweeping the crowd, then resting on Vanessa. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the store not with anger but with conviction. "You know," he began slowly, "I wasn't always this man you see standing here today. I wasn't always the guy people recognize or cheer for. Once upon a time, I was just a kid with nothing. Me and my mom, we struggled. We were evicted from our home. All we had between us was $7. 7. That's it. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Shoppers who had been smiling now grew serious, some blinking back tears. I remember nights when we didn't know how we were going to eat. I remember watching my mom cry because she couldn't pay the bills. And I remember walking into stores just like this one, praying no one would look down on us because we didn't have enough. Mrs. Thompson gasped softly, tears slipping down her wrinkled cheeks. She clasped her hands together as though the words had reached into her heart. The Rock continued, his tone tightening. So when I see someone counting pennies, when I see someone trying their best with what little they have, it doesn't remind me of weakness. It reminds me of strength. It reminds me of survival. It reminds me of love. He turned his gaze back to Vanessa, his eyes firm but not cruel. But when I see someone mocking coins, mocking struggle, it tells me one thing. That person doesn't understand what really matters. If you think coins make someone less human, then you've already lost everything that does. The words struck like thunder. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her arrogance dissolved, leaving only shame. She stared down at the register, unable to meet his eyes. Around them, the crowd was transformed. A young mother in line hugged her child tighter, tears in her eyes. An older man wiped at his face with the back of his hand. Even the teenagers, with their phones raised, lowered them for a moment, humbled by what they were hearing. The Rock's voice softened now, filled with compassion. Respect has nothing to do with money. It's not about what's in your wallet, it's about what's in your heart. I've met millionaires who are miserable, and I've met people with nothing who give more love than anyone else on this earth. The difference isn't wealth, it's respect. He stepped closer to Mrs. Thompson and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. This woman right here, she deserves respect. Not because of what she has or doesn't have, but because she's human. Because she's someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who's lived through battles we'll never know, and the least we can give her is kindness. The silence that followed was almost sacred. The weight of his words pressed into every soul in the store, reshaping the atmosphere entirely. Mrs. Thompson looked up at him through her tears and whispered, "Bless you." The Rock smiled, then turned back to the crowd, his final words ringing like a bell. If you leave here tonight with groceries, good. But if you leave here tonight with respect for others, that's even better. Because that's the kind of wealth no one can ever take from you. The crowd erupted again, not with the shallow applause of celebrity, but with the deep, heartfelt clapping of people who knew they had just witnessed something rare, something real. Shoppers cheered, some crying, some smiling through tears. Vanessa stood frozen, her arrogance gone, replaced by the heavy silence of realization. And in that moment, she, like everyone else, knew she had been changed. The store was still buzzing from the Rock's powerful words when he turned gently toward Mrs. Thompson. His massive hand rested lightly on her shoulder, the gesture both protective and encouraging. He bent down slightly so his eyes met hers. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying warmth, "would you share your story with us? People should know who you are, not just see you counting coins. They should understand the life behind those coins." Mrs. Thompson blinked, surprised. Her hands trembled as she held the last of her groceries close to her chest. She shook her head modestly at first. "Oh, I don't think anyone wants to hear about me." But then she looked around and saw dozens of eyes, curious, waiting, filled not with judgment but with respect. For the first time in years, she felt like her voice mattered. She took a shaky breath and began. I worked as a nurse," she said, her voice soft but steadying as she went on. "For over 40 years. I cared for people when they were at their weakest. I held hands in the middle of the night when families couldn't be there. I saw lives end, and I saw lives begin. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it." Shoppers leaned closer, the weight of her words silencing even the faintest whispers. A young woman in the crowd pressed a tissue to her eyes. "Mrs." Thompson's voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. My husband, he got sick. Cancer. Her lips trembled. I spent everything we had on his treatments. Every dollar, every bit of savings, gone. I told him we'd beat it together. But in the end, I just held his hand as he slipped away. Her eyes welled with tears, and so did the eyes of many listening. Even Vanessa, the cashier, lowered her head, shame burning her cheeks as she remembered her cruel words. After he passed, I didn't have much left, Mrs. Thompson continued. So now, I live simply. I collect coins in a little jar. Every week I count and count until I have just enough for bread, milk, maybe a few vegetables. Today I thought I had enough, but I miscounted. Her voice broke as she looked down at the purse in her wrinkled hands, and that's why I stood here humiliated. Not because I didn't want to pay Mao, but because I couldn't. The silence was deafening. The shoppers stood frozen, some openly crying, others biting their lips to hold back tears. For a moment, the entire store felt less like a marketplace and more like a place of confession, of truth. The Rock's jaw tightened as he listened, but his eyes glistened with compassion. He placed a firm, steady hand on Mrs. Thompson's shoulder once more. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and unwavering, "you've already given more to this world than money ever could. You've spent your life healing others, sacrificing for love, showing strength when most would have broken. What you've done, no amount of coins could ever measure that." Mrs. Thompson sobbed quietly, but these were no longer tears of humiliation. They were tears of release. She felt seen, valued, respected. A ripple of emotion surged through the crowd. A middle-aged man whispered, "My mother was a nurse. She was just like her." Another shopper wiped his eyes and nodded. People who had moments ago been strangers now felt united by her story. Vanessa, unable to bear the weight of her guilt, finally spoke. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I didn't know. I'm sorry." She lowered her head, unable to meet Mrs. Thompson's gaze. The Rock turned toward her, his voice steady but not cruel, and that's why we listen before we judge. Because every person has a story. Every coin she dropped tonight is a piece of a life lived with love, with sacrifice, with dignity. The crowd erupted, not in cheers this time, but in something deeper. A murmur of agreement, of understanding, of shared humanity. Mrs. Thompson looked up at the Rock and managed a trembling smile. "Thank you. Thank you for reminding me I still matter." And in that single moment, her truth became everyone's lesson. The air inside the store felt different now. What had begun as an ordinary day of shopping, filled with beeping scanners and idle chatter, had shifted into something extraordinary. People weren't just watching anymore. They were feeling. Mrs. Thompson's truth had touched every single soul, and then something even more powerful happened. A young mother holding her toddler against her hip stepped forward from the line. Her eyes were red from tears, but her voice was firm. "Ma'am," she said to Mrs. Thompson, "please let me pay for your groceries today. You've cared for others your whole life. It's time someone cares for you." Mrs. Thompson gasped, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "Oh no, sweetheart. You've got your own little one to feed. I can't." But the mother smiled, through her tears. "You've done enough. Please, let me do this for you." The crowd murmured approvingly. Another man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward next. He carried his keys in his hand and looked straight at Mrs. Thompson. "I'll drive you home," he said. "You shouldn't be carrying these bags alone, not tonight." Mrs. Thompson's lips quivered. She could hardly believe strangers, people who moments earlier hadn't even noticed her, were now surrounding her with kindness. A teenager with earbuds dangling from his hoodie stepped up too. He looked nervous, but determined. "I'll carry your bags," he offered, avoiding eye contact but clearly sincere. I want to help." One by one, voices rose from the crowd. "I'll bring you some meals next week. If you ever need someone to fix things around the house, I'm your guy. You shouldn't ever feel alone." It was no longer just about Mrs. Thompson. It was about everyone rediscovering compassion they had forgotten in their busy lives. And then, slowly, the cashier, Vanessa, took a step forward. Her hands were trembling, her face flushed with shame. The smirk and arrogance she had worn earlier were gone. Her voice cracked as she spoke, each word heavy with guilt. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I judged you, I mocked you, and I had no right. I let my pride make me cruel." Tears slid down her cheeks as she lowered her head. "I promise, I'll never treat anyone like that again." The store went silent, watching. All eyes shifted to the Rock, waiting to see how he would respond. He stepped closer, his massive presence filling the space. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Vanessa," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Apologies matter, but remember this. Respect must be given freely, not only when you're forced to give it. True respect is how you treat people when you think no one is watching." Vanessa nodded through her tears, his words striking deeper than any punishment could. She knew this moment would stay with her forever. The Rock then turned back to Mrs. Thompson. He picked up her small bag of groceries and handed it gently to the teenager who had volunteered to carry them. "Take care of this lady," he said. The boy nodded with pride. The old woman's eyes shone as she looked around, at the strangers who were no longer strangers, at the young mother offering help, at the man offering a ride, at the crowd that now stood not in judgment, but in solidarity. "This," she whispered, her voice cracking, "this feels like family." The Rock smiled. "That's because kindness turns strangers into family. And tonight, this store became a home." And just like that, the store that had once echoed with cruel chuckles and humiliating whispers was now alive with something else: applause, laughter, tears, and unity. People hugged each other, shook hands, and smiled at Mrs. Thompson as though she were a queen walking through her kingdom. What began as humiliation had transformed into a moment no one would ever forget, a reminder that kindness can spread like fire, and that even the smallest gesture can ignite a chain of compassion strong enough to change lives. The cameras of the bystanders had long since stopped recording. The cheers had quieted, yet the impact of what had happened lingered in the air like a powerful echo. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the store, her old coin purse tucked safely away, her groceries now resting in sturdy hands that belonged not to strangers anymore, but to friends she never knew she had. She looked around, overwhelmed by the warmth, by the kindness that had poured into her life in the space of mere minutes. And then, the narrator's voice carried gently over the scene, woven with swelling, emotional music. That day, a cashier learned that arrogance is weakness, not strength, that mocking someone for their struggle does not make you superior. It only reveals your own emptiness. A crowd discovered that kindness is not just a fleeting act. It is a force, one that can spread from one soul to another, transforming indifference into compassion, and strangers into a family. And an elderly woman, who had spent her life giving care, love, and sacrifice to others, was reminded that her dignity could never be counted in coins. Her worth was not measured by the contents of her purse, but by the immeasurable legacy of her love. The music swelled higher, strings blending with piano as the camera lingered on the Rock, still standing tall, yet humble, blending back into the crowd as if he had only been a passing storm of light. The Rock, one of the most powerful souls, showed us that true greatness has nothing to do with fame or strength or wealth. It is measured in compassion, in the courage to stand up when others stay silent, in the willingness to lift someone else's burden even when the world isn't watching. True greatness is kindness. The narrator's voice lowered now, tender and deliberate. Remember this: respect costs nothing, but it has the power to change everything. One word of kindness can mend a broken heart. One act of compassion can restore someone's dignity. And one choice made in the name of love can transform the world around us. The final shot came quietly. Mrs. Thompson walked slowly out of the supermarket doors, her bags carried carefully by the young teenager, her shoulders no longer hunched with shame, but lifted with pride. Her steps, though small, were steady. Her head held high, and just behind her, almost unnoticed, the Rock slipped back into the crowd. Hood up once again, disappearing not as a star demanding attention, but as a man who had given it freely. He left no spotlight, no stage, no demand for recognition, only the memory of what he had done. The music swelled to its final notes, and the narrator's words hung in the air like a lasting truth. Greatness is not what the world gives you. It is what you choose to give back. Respect, kindness, compassion. These cost nothing, yet they are priceless. Carry them with you, because you never know when someone's life might change, simply because you chose to care. And with that, the screen faded to black.